me the story of Jesus, right from my heart every word. Tell me the story most precious, sweetest that ever was heard. Love in that story so tender, clearer than ever I see. Say, let me read while you whisper, love paid the ransom for me. Tell me the story most precious, sweetest that ever was heard.
Okay, we're going to pick up with Elijah again. We left him off here for a little bit, but we're going to get back to talking about Elijah. Now, we finished chapter 17, and they mowing the lawn out there. And we're going to pick up now in chapter 18. It's been about 3.5 years. I know it seems like it has been in here in the room, but it's been about 3.5 years since God sent Elijah actually 3 years since he sent him to speak to Ahab. And it's been almost 3.5 years since it's rained. And so in the beginning of this, in chapter 17, Elijah had gone to Ahab and told him that as the Lord God of Israel liveth before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, but according to my word. And during that 3 years, he had, for all intents and purposes, been in seclusion, which is a pretty rough thing for a prophet with the spirit of Elijah to do. For someone like that to sit on his hands for 3 years in utter seclusion and not even let anybody know who he was, that's tough. That's a tough job. He started by spending a year at the brook Kerith, where you remember he was fed by ravens for about a year. And then he spent another 2 years at the widow's house in Zarephath, where he was fed out of a little barrel of meal that just never seemed to run out, for 2 years there. And for someone, in Luke chapter 1 and verse 17, it talks about John the Baptist. And we all know John the Baptist, well, he was a pretty gutsy guy. He was not I can't think of the word he wasn't just some little, pussy willow blowing in he was a pretty strong dude. And in Luke 1:17 it says, and he shall go before him, referring to John the Baptist, in the spirit and power of Elias, to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. You see, John the Baptist was likened like Elijah, so you can learn things about Elijah when you look at John the Baptist. In some respects, we know more about John the Baptist than we do about Elijah. We don't know anything about Elijah other than he showed up one day and stood before the most evil king that ever ruled Israel. Well, that takes a little bit of intestinal fortitude. It's not an easy thing to do. It's not an easy thing to do to stand up in front of a crowd of people that like you, let alone standing up in front of somebody that would just as soon see you dead. That's tough. And so Elijah had that kind of a spirit, and then he has to spend 3 years sitting on his hands. That's something that God does to his ministers. There was a time when Conrad Jarrell spent 4 or 5 years out of the ministry. I forget there were so many churches back then, I forget which one it was, but there was, when the Primitive Baptist split happened, he went back to school, went to Auburn University, got a bachelor's degree, and then was accepted into the program for a doctorate in economics and was just about ready to start classes when another little church started up and called him to preach, and he gave up that to go back into the ministry again. But for all those years, he was out of the ministry. Ben had similar similar examples when times when you have to just sit on your hands. It happens sometimes, and during those times, those are times when you're tested, and those are times when you learn patience, and those are times when you're receiving benefits. You're just not standing in a pulpit. You're still being trained, you're still learning, you're still getting ready for the next chapter in your career, if you will. But that's what Elijah had to go through. He had to sit there for 3 years. And that does teach patience. That teaches somebody to be patient, to wait until God's ready to use you, to wait until it's time for the phone to ring. I guess it would be like the guys that are sitting out in the dugout that keep waiting for the phone to ring so they know when they finally get to go relieve the pitcher and throw a couple of balls. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 4, Paul says, "But in all things approving ourselves as the minister of God in much patience, in afflictions and necessities and distresses." This is a trait that ministers have to learn. They have to learn patience. Some are better than others. Some of us have a long way to go. But it's a trait that ministers have to have. And that's one of the reasons that sometimes God will make you sit on your hands for a while. Paul said in 2 Corinthians 12:12, "Truly the signs of an apostle were wrought among you in all patience, in signs and wonders and mighty deeds." So you see, that is a trait of a man of God, is to have patience. And in James chapter 1 and verse 3, James says, "Knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience." That's one of the reasons that we go through some of the trials we go through, some of the battles that we have to fight. They're there to teach us patience. But there's something else here. This was also a time that Elijah was able to confirm to himself that he really was a man of God. This is something that a lot of ministers wrestle with. Phil Yunker has wrestled with this one. I wrestle with it. I know Conrad wrestled with it. Conrad told me one time it was his third church when he finally came to the conclusion that, yeah, he was called to preach. Most guys that are honest about this do that. We wonder, am I really called of God to do this, or is this just me? And Elijah, I'm sure, probably wrestled with it himself. But you should stop and think about some of the seals of Elijah's ministry so far. All he's done is delivered one message. He had delivered one message to Ahab, and yet he'd lived a year by a brook with ravens bringing him food. Does that not testify that there's something out of the ordinary here? When you would have expected him to starve to death, somehow ravens kept showing up with food. So he was sustained by God. Obviously, God was involved in this somehow. And then he went to the widow's house and spent 2 years there eating out of a barrel that never wasted away. When you would have, for all intents and purposes, thought he would have starved to death there, he didn't. Somehow God provided for him, and then he raised her son from the dead. So Elijah was now very convinced that God was involved in this, and that gave him the strength that he would need to go face this guy again. Because, as we're going to see, the first time Ahab didn't know what to expect of him. This time Ahab knows very well who he is. Ahab has been looking for him. Ahab has put contracts out to try to find this guy. So now he's got to march back into Samaria again and face this wicked king. And so with those seals, and in fact the one that we ended our last our last time with 1 Kings 17:24, the woman said to Elijah, "Now by this I know that thou art a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in thy mouth is true." With that seal, he's ready now to go face the conflict that he's going to have to face on Mount Carmel. So that brings us up to where we are today, and we're going to start here at 1 Kings chapter 18 and verse 1. "And it came to pass after many days that the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year, saying, Go show thyself unto Ahab, and I will send rain upon the earth." Now I intend to get through this verse today. I don't know that we'll get any farther, but I think this one will be enough. And the first thing that I want to point out about this verse, we know that it was 3 years. It says that it was in the 3rd year, so we know that. But notice what the Spirit says here. After many days. There's a lesson to be learned in that. There's a lesson to be learned in the fact that the Spirit specifically says it came to pass after many days. And that lesson is found in Job chapter 14. Job chapter 14. This is something that we should constantly judge ourselves by and try to live one day at a time. Now I know we always try to make plans for what we're going to do in a week or a month or a year or whatever, and you should do that. But when it comes to your life, when it comes to the way you live your life, you should live every day as if tonight you're going to stand before the Almighty. That this is it. And if we all did that, we would all live better lives. If you knew that today was the end, that you were going to face Christ at 5 o'clock this afternoon, you'd be a better Christian than if you thought, well, I don't have to worry about that today. Every day you should get up thinking, this could be my last. Could be. How do you know? How do you know you're not going to walk out that room and get run over by a truck? You don't. So every day you should live that way. Job said in chapter 14, verse 1, "Man that is born of a woman is a few days, and full of trouble. He cometh forth like a flower, and is cut down. He fleeth also as a shadow, and continueth not." And if you look at Genesis chapter 47, there was a time when Pharaoh, talking to Jacob, wanted to know how old he was. Asked him how old he was. This was back when Joseph was in Egypt. We're going to talk a little bit more about him today also. But in Genesis 47 and verse 9, Jacob said unto Pharaoh, "The days of the years of my pilgrimage are 132 years. Few and evil have the days of the years of my life have been, and have not attained unto the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage." Jacob judged his life by days, not by years, and we should do the same. David said in Psalm 90 and verse 12, "So teach us to number our days, that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom." Every day is a gift from God. Start the day knowing that, and end the day knowing that that may be all you have. And if you will live your life in accordance with that, you'll live a better life. You'll be a better Christian. If you know that this could be it, I'm going to have to face him tonight. And we should thus live every day that way. Turn over to Matthew chapter 24. We've got a little bit of a long reading here, but I think it's worth it. And this is Christ speaking about this same type of a topic. Matthew 24 is what we call the Olivet Discourse. And again, I'm not going to get into it right now, but there is a teaching towards the end of the chapter, beginning at verse 42, where Christ says, "Watch therefore, for ye know not what hour your Lord doth come. But know this, that if the goodman of the house had known in what watch the thief would come, he would have watched, and would not have suffered his house to be broken up. Well, obviously, if you know there's going to be a thief show up at 1 o'clock in the morning, you're probably going to be awake at 1 o'clock in the morning sitting at the front doorstep with a shotgun in your hand. But if you don't know when he's going to show up, you don't know. Therefore be ye also ready, for in such an hour as ye think not, the Son of Man cometh. Who then is a faithful and wise servant, whom his Lord hath made ruler over his household, to give them meat in due season? Blessed is that servant whom his Lord, when he cometh, shall find so doing. Verily I say unto you, that he shall make him ruler over all of his goods. But, and if that evil servant shall say in his heart, My Lord delayeth his coming, and shall begin to smite his fellow servants, and to eat and drink with the drunken, the Lord of that servant shall come in a day when he looketh not for him, and in an hour that he is not aware of, and he shall cut him asunder, and appoint him his portion with the hypocrites. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Every day we should live as if that is the day. Paul told us the same thing over in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, talking about the same occasion, talking about when Christ is going to return. And Paul said in 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 1, But the times and the seasons, brethren, ye have no need that I write unto you. For yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night. For when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them, as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. But ye, brethren, are not in darkness, that that day should overtake you as a thief. Ye are all the children of light and the children of the day. We are not of the night, nor of darkness. Therefore let us not sleep as others do, but let us watch and be sober. For they that sleep, sleep in the night, and they that be drunken are drunken in the night. But let us, who are of the day, be sober, putting on the breastplate of faith and love, and for an helmet the hope of salvation. For God hath not appointed us to wrath, but to obtain salvation by our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us, that whether we wake or sleep, we should live together with him. Wherefore comfort yourselves together and edify one another, even as also ye do. We should look each day as if this could be my last day. And so if you have opportunity to do good, if it were your last day, wouldn't you? I mean, I know that there's a lot of people in the world that will say, well, I'm going to live like this day is my last, and that translates into I'm going to party like it's 1999. Well, that's not the way a Christian should look at it. You should look at it from the standpoint of this could be my last day. And so if I have opportunity to do good, I'm going to do good. If I have opportunity to help someone, I'm going to help them. If, you know, I was a Boy Scout. We used to have to learn how to help little old ladies across the street instead of complaining about them and they're moving so slow with their walkers. And we have a few of those down here. So if you have a chance, just pick them up and carry them across the street. And as they're beating on your chest because they didn't want to go across the street, well, I think there was a joke in there. So I think there was a joke like that sometime. Whatever. This is one of the reasons that Christ said in Matthew 6:34, Take therefore no thought for the morrow. For the morrow shall take thought for the things of itself. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. So think in turn, I mean, always plan as if you're going to live for the next 100 years, but when you live your life, live it a day at a time. Get through today. Worry about tomorrow when tomorrow gets here. Of course you're going to plan. Of course you're going to save. Of course you're going to do all those other things. But when it comes to making the decisions to get through today, live as if today's your last. And you'll just live a better life. You just will. I mean, if you knew you were going to have to face God in an hour and a half, for the next hour and a half, you're going to clean up your life. Right? I would. You'd be a fool not to. So if you just live that way, then you got nothing to worry about. Because then he won't overtake you as a thief, because you were sitting there expecting him. And that's really what it amounts to. Be ready for him when he comes. So 1 Kings chapter 18:1, And it came to pass after many days that the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year, saying, Go show thyself unto Ahab. And it came to pass That's an interesting little saying. And it's something that another thing that we have to pay attention to. Let's not forget that God is always in total and complete control of everything that goes on down here. It came to pass, in other words, the time was up. It's now time for Elijah to go do what God wants him to do. He's fulfilled the number of days that were set aside for him to do that. I want you to turn over to Exodus chapter 2, because I want to show you something that maybe you have never seen before in the life of Moses that's really very telling and shows, again, God being in absolute, total control of a situation, even though the children of Israel didn't sometimes think so. And sometimes we don't think so either. In Exodus chapter 2 and verse 23, it says, "And it came to pass," there's that saying again, "and it came to pass in process of time, that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed by reason of the bondage, and they cried, and their cry came up unto God by reason of the bondage." These are the children of Israel in Egypt, when they were slaves to Pharaoh. And if you continue on with the reading, you'll see that this is just about the time God's getting ready to call Moses into service. But I want to show you that this was all according to a plan that had been prophesied years and years before. It had been prophesied 400 and some odd years before to Abraham. Flip over to Genesis chapter 15. Abraham is having a dream. And in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 12, it says, "And when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and lo, and horror of great darkness fell upon him." That sounds like a nightmare, but... "And he said unto Abram, Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward shall they come out with great substance. And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace, thou shalt be buried in a good old age." Stop right there, but keep your finger there, because we're going to come back and flip over to Acts chapter 7. So God's talking to Abram, telling him that that his children, which would eventually be the children of Israel, would be in a strange land for a period of time. Well, that land was Egypt. All you have to do is read the history books and you'll see that land was Egypt, and that they would be afflicted. But there would come a time when they would come out. In Acts chapter 7 and verse 17, it says, "But when the time of the promise drew nigh, which God had sworn to Abraham," this is what we're talking about, that promise, "the people grew and multiplied in Egypt, till another king arose which knew not Joseph." Now you remember, we talked about Joseph earlier in this series, how Joseph was second in command in Egypt when Jacob and the 12 sons, the other 11 sons, came into Egypt to buy corn, and they eventually ended up moving there. They moved into Egypt, and Joseph had set things up to where they were pretty well taken care of. Well, now a king comes along that doesn't even remember who Joseph was, and at that point in time brought the Israelites into slavery. Things changed. With the kingdom, sometimes things change. So till another king which arose, which knew not Joseph, the same dealt subtly with our kindred, and evil entreated our fathers, so that they cast out their young children to the end they might not live. You remember the story of Moses, where the Pharaoh decided to kill all the babies, and Moses ended up being put in a little ark made out of bulrushes and was found by Pharaoh's daughter and raised up in Pharaoh's household. In which time Moses was born, and was exceeding fair, and nourished up in his father's house 3 months. And when he was cast out, Pharaoh's daughter took him up and nourished him for her own son. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was mighty in words and deeds. Okay, so we're talking about that period of time when the children of Israel had gone into Egypt, and they were actually living in Goshen, which is outside of the main city. And they'd been there for some time. Pharaohs had changed. Now we've got a new Pharaoh, doesn't remember Joseph. Now he turns them into slaves in Egypt, right? Now flip back to Genesis chapter 15 and let's look at verse 16, because this is a very telling verse. In verse 15, verse 13, it said that they shall afflict them 400 years. In verse 16, it says, but in the 4th generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. In other words, Abram, they will be down there until the 4th generation, and in the 4th generation I'll bring them out. Okay? Turn to Exodus chapter 6. You know, there's a passage over in Acts we're not going to turn to, but it talks about how Moses, when you remember when he killed the Egyptian because the guy was picking on a couple of Hebrews, and it makes reference to the idea that Moses did this thinking that these Hebrews would understand that he was going to be the deliverer. And for a long time I wondered, well, how in the world did he know that? How could he know that he hadn't even seen the burning bush yet? How is he supposed to know he's supposed to? Well, I'm going to show you why. Exodus chapter 6 and verse 16. And these are the names of the son of Levi. Now remember, Levi is one of the 12 that went into Egypt with Jacob. He's one of the 12 sons of Jacob, one of the 12 tribes. The sons of Jacob were the tribes of Israel. Okay? So, and to make up for Joseph being gone, there were Manasseh and Ephraim, which they called half-tribes. They were sons of Joseph. So, but when Jacob and the other sons moved into Egypt, Levi was with them. He was one of them. He was the one to whom the priesthood was eventually given to. And these are the names of the sons of Levi according to their generations. Gershon and Kohath and Moriah, and the years of the life of Levi were 137 years. Okay? You say, okay, your point? Jump down to verse 18, and let's look at the sons of Kohath. And the sons of Kohath, Amram and Ishhar and Hebron and Uzal, and the years of the life of Kohath were 133 years. Okay? Now jump down to verse 20. And Amram, who's Amram? Amram was the son of Kohath. We just saw that in verse 18. Who's Kohath? Kohath was the son of Levi. We saw that in verse 16. And Amram took him Jochebed, his father's sister, to wife, and she bare him Aaron and Moses. And the years of the life of Amram were 137 years. Levi was the first generation that went into Egypt. And then the second generation was Kohath. And the third generation was Amram. And the fourth generation was Aaron and Moses. You see, Moses could very well figure that he was the deliverer. He was in the fourth generation. And God had said that in the fourth generation, he would bring these people out of Egypt. He wouldn't bring them out until then. He had to wait until the process of time had gone through. But the process came through. And we read in Exodus chapter 2 and verse 23. This is where we started this. And it came to pass in process of time that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed by reason of the bondage, and they cried, and their cry came up unto God by reason of the bondage, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. He had prophesied it would take 4 generations, and in 4 generations he brought them out, just like he said he would. It took the amount of time that he said it would take, but it didn't take any more. It took exactly that amount of time. God's timing is always exact. It's always correct. We might not understand it. We might not understand why sometimes it seems to take as long as it does, but God's in control, and He'll work things out the way that He wants to work things out. It's our duty just to be faithful to Him and trust Him. In Galatians chapter 4 and verse 4, speaking of Jesus Christ, Paul says, "But when the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth His Son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons." And so we read here, it came to pass after many days. You think about it, there were over 1,000 days that Elijah had been sitting on his hands. That's a bunch of days, many days. After many days that the word of the Lord came to Elijah. God hadn't forgotten him. God didn't forget where he was. He never forgets his servants, and he never forgets his children. He knows where you are. He knows what you're going through. And he knows that sometimes he's going to let you go through it for a while because it'll teach you patience. Sometimes you have to go through that. It's our duty just to be faithful to him to the limit of the light that we have, and to just trust that he'll see us through it. And then eventually, when the time comes to do something else, then the phone will ring or something else. Isaiah chapter 49, verse 15. I'm talking about how God does not forget his children. Isaiah 49:15, he asks the question of the prophet, "Can a woman forget her sucking child, that she should not have compassion on the son of her womb?" We have some mothers in the room. You think you can forget your own kids? Well, you could. We've seen some happen. In the town that Wendy and I came from, there's been a rash of people forgetting their own children and laying them in trash cans and leaving them for somebody else to find. Humans can be pretty despicable in that sense. I wouldn't expect that from any of the women in this room, but that's not to say that they can't. Can a woman forget her sucking child, that she should not have compassion on the son of her womb? Yea, they may forget. Yet will I not forget thee. Behold, I have graven thee upon the palms of my hands. Thy walls are continually before me. God doesn't forget his children. He knows where you are. He knows what you're going through. He's as close as he can possibly be. Sometimes you'll struggle and think he's not there, but he's there. He's right there watching you. He's in control of the situation, whatever it is. And so we should be like David. We should say like David in Psalm 16:8, "I have set the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand. I shall not be moved." And in Psalm 73:21, "Thus my heart was grieved, and I was pricked in my reins. So foolish was I and ignorant. I was as a beast before thee. Nevertheless, I am continually with thee. Thou hast holden me by my right hand. Thou shalt guide me with thy counsel, and afterward receive me to glory. Whom have I in heaven but thee? And there is none upon the earth that I desire beside thee. My flesh and my heart faileth, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever." We should remember that, because God remembers us. And he remembered Elijah. He didn't forget where Elijah was. He was just waiting for the proper time, and when the proper time came, he called him up. So when you go through something that seems like it's taken forever, just understand that part of that is it's just not time yet. And when it's time, it'll make itself plain, and it will just be obvious. But sometimes we just have to wait. And the waiting teaches us patience. So back to 1 Kings 18:1, and it came to pass after many days that the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year, saying, Go show thyself unto Ahab, and I will send rain upon the earth. So that we can better understand this incredible test of the courage of this prophet, we need to try to consider the state of mind of King Ahab over the course of these last 3 years. We're told in verse 2 that there was a sore famine in Samaria. And I can imagine that there would have been. 3.5 years with no rain and no dew. I can imagine that, there would be a sore famine. Look at verses 1 Kings 18, 5 through 6. We're going to jump down a little bit so that we can get an idea of what's going on in Ahab's mind, because this is the guy that Elijah is going to have to present himself before. Okay? 18:5. And Ahab said unto Obadiah. Obadiah, by the way, I've mentioned him before. We're going to mention him quite a bit here. Obadiah was a prophet. There's a book in your Bible called Obadiah. It's only 1 chapter long. But he was also the governor of Israel. He worked directly underneath Ahab. Okay, we'll get to more comments about him in a few minutes. And Ahab said unto Obadiah, Go into the land, unto the fountains of water, and unto all brooks, peradventure we may find grass, to save the horses and mules alive, that we lose not all of the beasts. So they divided the land between them to pass throughout it. Ahab went one way by himself, and Obadiah went another way by himself. He's trying to find a little bit of grass just to try to keep the animals alive. We're down to that point. Think about this. An agricultural area that has no rain or dew for 3.5 years. And they're just out looking for a little sprig of grass somewhere. The land is devastated. This kingdom has been devastated. And it's only been less than 60 years since Solomon. We covered that in the very first lesson on this. Turn back to 1 Kings chapter 10. And let's look at the kingdom under Solomon just 60-some years before. It was 58 years from the time of Solomon until this story began, and now it's been another 3 years since that. So call it 61 years. My lifetime. My lifetime. That's not that long. And let's look at what Israel was then and compare it with what it is now as a result of the apostasy of these kings. 1 Kings chapter 10 and verse 1. And when the queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to prove him with hard questions. And she came to Jerusalem with a very great train, with camels that bear spices and very much gold and precious stones. And when she was come to Solomon, she communed with him of all that was in her heart. And Solomon told her all of her questions. There was not anything hid from the king, which he told her not. And when the queen of Sheba had seen all Solomon's wisdom in the house that he had built, in the meat of his table, in the sitting of his servants, in the attendance of his ministers, in their apparel, in the cupbearers, and his ascent by which he went up into the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. And she said to the king, It was a true report that I heard in mine own land of thy acts and of thy wisdom, howbeit I believed not the words till I came, and mine eyes have seen it, and behold, the half was not told me. Thy wisdom and prosperity exceedeth the fame which I heard. Happy are thy men, happy are these thy servants, which stand continually before thee, that hear thy wisdom. Blessed be the Lord thy God, which delighteth in thee to set thee on the throne of Israel, because the Lord loved Israel forever. Therefore made he thee king to do judgment and justice. And she gave the king 120 talents of gold, and of spices of very great store, and precious stones. There came no more such abundance of spices as these which the king of Sheba gave to Solomon. At the time that Solomon was the king, Israel was the richest land in the world, and it's now been leveled to nothing in a period of 61 years. Doesn't take long to destroy a country. Doesn't take long to completely devastate a country when you get God mad at you. And so for these 3.5 years, now, since Ahab had turned away from the living God and started serving Baal, the king of Israel is now out on his own hands and knees, searching for a little bit of grass so that he can save the beasts, rather than holding court. Now let's look at a couple of things about this. 1 Kings 18:5, and Ahab said unto Obadiah, go into the land, unto all fountains of water, and unto all brooks, peradventure we may find grass to save the horses and mules alive, that we lose not all of the beasts. I want you to notice something. There is not one syllable in reference to God. Not one mention whatsoever of this wicked king in reference to God. Not one word about the terrible sins that he'd committed. Not one word about what had called down God's displeasure on the nation. All he could think about were fountains and brooks and sprigs of grass and temporal blessings. He had no interest whatsoever in God, which is exactly what he should have done to turn the situation around. But that's the way it is with reprobate people. They're not concerned with God. He never enters into their thoughts. It's always something else. They're only concerned with temporal stuff, because that's all they have is temporal stuff. Look at the example of Pharaoh. Think about the example. We're not going to turn to it. We don't have the time. But think of the example of Pharaoh. When Moses would come along with a plague, and it would devastate his land, and then he would repent, and he'd beg Moses to talk to God and get rid of the flies or get rid of the lice or whatever it was. And Moses would pray to God, and the lice would go away, or the flies, and he'd harden his heart, go right back to kicking against God again. That's the way reprobate are. It's the way they've always been. That's total depravity. And we teach it from the pulpit, but here's an example to actually look at it. This is what's out there. Because there are people out there that have the same heart that Ahab had, that have the same heart that Pharaoh had. And that's the way they are. Look at Revelation chapter 16. Even at the end of time, when God is pouring out the plagues on the people at the very end, they're still going to stand there and shake their fist at him. Revelation 16 and verse 10, and the fifth angel poured out his vial upon the seat of the beast, and his kingdom was full of darkness, and they gnawed their tongues for pain, and blasphemed the God of heaven because of their pains and their sores, and repented not of their deeds. That's the way of reprobate people. That's the way they are. You start putting pressure on them, and they'll just start screaming at God. Turn to Jeremiah chapter 5. Because nowhere is the awful depravity of human nature more grievously displayed than at this very point. You know, you have a dry season, you go into a drought, and the first thing, people just kind of think it's a freak of nature. And then if they ever understand that it's a divine judgment, well, then they just get mad at God. How could he do this to us? Why would he do this to us? Jeremiah chapter 5 and verse 3 says, O Lord, are not thine eyes upon the truth? Thou hast stricken them, but they have not grieved. Thou hast consumed them, but they have refused to receive correction. They have made their faces harder than a rock. They've refused to return. And that's the way reprobate people are. Now I know some people are, I'm going to mention something here, and I know somebody's going to misunderstand this and say that I'm saying that the drought in California is a divine judgment, and I'm not saying that, so if you say I said it, you're a liar. That's not what I'm saying, but I want you to look at it for a minute, because maybe it could be, but what I want to show you is that the people there are doing the same thing that Ahab did. I want you to see the example of how, what did Ahab, what was he worried about? He was worried about the temporal stuff. He never for a minute thought that maybe God wasn't really involved in this. We just got to find some grass and keep these beasts alive. So let's look at California, which is right now is led by Jerry Brown. And I don't know if you know this or not, but both houses of the legislature have a 2/3 majority of extremely left-wing liberals. They are veto-proof. They can do anything they want, and they've done anything they want. I was looking at some pictures from the Golden State, and you can do a Google search and look at the photos of Folsom Lake. There was a dam there. It's a man-made lake up by Sacramento. They built a dam, and you look at the pictures from 2011, and the lake is full, and there's a spillway running over, filling the aqueduct. You look at it today, the boat docks are on dirt. There's no water behind it anymore. It looks like a desert. I mean, they are seriously, now they got a bunch of rain this weekend, but all it did was turn into mudslides because they don't have any water. And so let's think about the policies of that particular state for a minute. Jerry Brown was governor in the 70s and early 80s, and then he became governor again 4 years ago, something like that. He was the youngest governor in the state of California, and he is now the oldest governor in the state of California. He set both of those records. During his second term in the early 80s, he was the first of any American politician ever, anywhere, to appoint an openly homosexual judge. He also appointed an openly lesbian judge, the first in the nation to do it. During that term, he appointed 5 of them over the course of that term. Since 2011, he has released almost 1,400 violent criminals to save money so that he could fund social programs for people that come into the country illegally. You got to take from Peter, rob Peter to pay Paul. So one of the ways you do this is you just release a bunch of criminals out onto the street, and that way we don't have to pay for them anymore. We'll just let the people deal with it. California was the first state in the country to make no-fault divorces a law in violation of God's law. They were the first. You would have thought it was Nevada, but it wasn't. In Nevada, you still had to have cause, not California. You had to wait a year. I think it's a year or 6 months or something like that, but you didn't have to, but you could just get a divorce just because I don't like this person anymore. Where prior to that, you had to have cause. They were the first state to sign into law a domestic partnership bill, which granted rights to homosexual couples that were very much like those that are married. They have the highest percentage of homosexuals in the nation, and San Francisco has the highest percentage of a city in the nation. Right now, as a result of the drought that they're in, almond farmers are ripping up their trees. This is a $5 billion a year industry, and they're pulling trees out of the ground that are perfectly good trees. But almonds take a lot of water. So since almonds take water, and we can't feed them because we don't have enough water, we'll just pull the trees out of the ground and be done with it and grow something that doesn't require as much water. And when you read all of the articles, they've got NASA looking at doing satellite imagery, and they're trying to figure out. In fact, I think it was yesterday that Governor Brown signed a $687 million bill for construction of infrastructure so that they don't have to go through this again. Not one word of God. You see, the problem is they think that Mother Nature is being mean to them. But Mother Nature is a pagan deity. And they've completely ignored the fact that God could turn that drought off like that, if he wished to. But they're not going there. And in Jeremiah chapter 2 and verse 30, it says, "In vain have I smitten your children. They received no correction. Your own sword hath devoured your prophets like a destroying lion." We need to remember God's in control of these things. And it doesn't matter what country or what state it is. If you grow into disfavor with God, expect his wrath. And we'll see it towards the end of time. That's just the way it'll be. 1 Kings chapter 18 and verse 5. "And Ahab said unto Obadiah, Go into the land, and unto all fountains of water, and unto all brooks, peradventure we may grass to save the horses and mules alive, that we lose not all the beasts. So they divided the land between them to pass throughout it, and Ahab went one way by himself, and Obadiah went the other way by himself." So here you have the king and the governor out looking for grass to feed the beasts. I want you to look at something else. Not only did God have no place in Ahab's heart, you see any mention of the people? You see where he's concerned at all about the people? No. His thoughts are about mules and horses. He's not worried about the people that he's in charge of. He has no care for them. He's a politician. He's not concerned with the people. He's concerned with his own temporal blessings. I want you to turn to 2 Samuel chapter 24, and let's contrast this with King David. Because remember, David was a man after God's own heart. Yes, he was a king of Israel also, but he was a little bit different type of a king than Ahab. At a time when David got in trouble for numbering the people, God sent an angel to destroy or to punish, and as a result, there were 70,000 men that were killed from this angel. And then the angel was headed towards Jerusalem when God stopped him. And we read in 2 Samuel 24:17, and remember, this was David's fault. David caused this. Just like Ahab caused the problems in Israel by setting up a temple for Baal, which finally brought this calamity upon him. Ahab could have said, you know what, I blew it. I'm sorry, forgive me. But he didn't. He just dug in his heels. In 2 Samuel 24:17, "And David spake unto the Lord when he saw the angel that smote the people, and said, Lo, I have sinned, and I have done wickedly. But these sheep, what have they done? Let thine hand, I pray thee, be against me and against my father's house." That's what a regenerate king does. A regenerate king understands that he was the cause of the problem. We need to fix the problem. Punish me, don't punish these other people. They didn't have anything to do with this. Ahab couldn't care less about the other people. He was only concerned about himself. So that's the difference between a regenerate king and a non-regenerate king. In Daniel chapter 4 and verse 17, I go back to this verse a lot because this is one that really just says it. Daniel 4:17, "This matter is by decree of the watchers and the demand by the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the basest of men." the basest of men. It's been that way all along, folks. Been that way all along. Every once in a while you'll get a godly man that'll get into an office. He won't be there very long. He'll either term out or get voted out. But for the most part, we got the basest of men, and that's certainly what they had with Ahab. Look over at 1 Kings chapter 18 again, and we're going to look at verses 7 through 14. Because Elijah is now on his way. God's told him to go. And in verse 7 it says, "And as Obadiah was in the way, behold, Elijah met him. And he knew him, and fell on his face, and said, Art thou that my Lord Elijah? And he answered him, I am. Go tell thy Lord, behold, Elijah is here. And he said, What have I sinned? That thou wouldest deliver thy servant into the hand of Ahab to slay me? Really? You want me to go tell Ahab that you're here? As the Lord thy God liveth, there is no nation or kingdom whither my Lord hath not sent to seek thee. And when they said he is not there, he took an oath of the kingdom and nation that they found thee not. And now thou sayest, Go tell thy Lord, behold, Elijah is here? And it shall come to pass, as soon as I'm gone from thee, that the Spirit of the Lord shall carry thee whither I know not. And so when I come and tell Ahab, and he cannot find thee, he shall slay me. But I, thy servant, fear the Lord from my youth. Think about this. Ahab had searched all over the place trying to find Elijah. And remember, we're trying to get the idea of who this guy is that Elijah's going to have to face. He had sent out looking to all of the surrounding nations, trying to find out if Elijah, is he here? Talking to all of these rulers, and when they said no, we're not keeping him. We're not holding him, we're not providing asylum for him. Well, then he was having him sign an oath. Put your hand on a Bible and swear that you're not. He was out searching for him. He'd been out looking for him. So think about that when Elijah's got to walk up and face this guy. And not only that, in fact, worse than that, Jezebel, Ahab's wife, had been cutting off the prophets. Now what that means is she was killing them. She was killing off God's prophets. And that was the reason that, in fact, in verse 13, I'll just let the Bible say it. Was it not told my Lord what I did when Jezebel slew the prophets of the Lord, how I hid 100 men of the Lord's prophets by 50 in a cave and fed them with bread and water? See, Obadiah was a guy that was hiding the prophets out. When Jezebel had decided to launch against them and kill them off, he got 100 of them and hid them back in a cave and was taking care of them, giving them bread and water during the course of this drought so that Jezebel wouldn't find him. And now thou sayest, Go tell thy Lord, behold, Elijah is here, and he shall slay me. If I tell Ahab you're here, and when he comes back you're not here, he's going to kill me. Why would you do that? Why would you send me in to do something like that? By this time, after almost 3.5 years and no rain and no dew, Ahab clearly considered Elijah public enemy number one. And I would venture a guess that if they had cameras in those days, if you walked into a post office, you'd see a picture of Elijah hanging on the wall, wanted, dead or alive. Ahab was looking for him. His minions were looking for him. They were trying to find the guy, and this is the guy that Elijah is going to have to walk up and face. The first time that he walked up to him, Ahab didn't know him from a bale of hay. Now he knows who he is. And now he knows what he's gone through. And we're talking about a wicked king. So God says, Go show yourself to Ahab now, and I'll make it rain. Think of that. Think of what Elijah's stomach's got to be doing. turning over and over and over. Think about that. That's tough. Proverbs chapter 28 and verse 1 says, the wicked flee when no man pursueth, but the righteous are bold as a lion. And that's where Elijah got his strength. And so in 1 Kings 18:1, the verse that we're dealing with today, and it came to pass after many days that the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year, saying, go show thyself unto Ahab. I want you to notice it. Up to this point, and even on in a little bit further, all of Elijah's movements have been following what God told him to do. He went to Ahab. God tells him, go to the brook. So he went to the brook. God tells him, leave the brook and go to Zarephath. He leaves the brook and goes to Zarephath. Now God tells him to go to Samaria and present himself before Ahab. What's he going to do? He's going to do what he's told to do. And that's where he goes. And that's the lesson that a man of God has to learn. Your life's not your own anymore. Once they lay hands on you, your life is not your own anymore. You don't belong to yourself anymore. You go where you're told. You do what you're told. And that was a lesson that it took Elijah 3 years to learn. But he learned it, and learned it well. Paul learned it also in Acts chapter 20. Because Paul went through a lot of things, as we've already seen in this series, some of the struggles that Paul went through. And he says in Acts chapter 20, in verse 22, and now behold, I go bound in the Spirit unto Jerusalem, not knowing the things that shall befall me there, save that the Holy Ghost witnesseth in every city, saying that bonds and afflictions abide me. But he's going anyway. We know it's not going to be good. I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but it's not going to be good, but I'm going. That's where I'm headed. But none of these things move me, neither count I my life dear unto myself, so that I might finish my course with joy, and the ministry which I have received of the Lord Jesus, to testify the gospel of grace, of the grace of God. And now, behold, I know that ye all among whom I have gone preaching the kingdom of God shall see my face no more. Paul did the same thing that Elijah had to face. Now, there's a couple other points I want to make about Obadiah. There are some people that think that Obadiah had somehow become a traitor because he continued to work for Ahab as a governor. I mean, how could you work as for such a wicked king? But there's nothing in the Bible to suggest that that's an issue. Consider this. There were other men that God raised up under other heathen kings at one time or another. Look at Daniel under Nebuchadnezzar. He raised him up. Nebuchadnezzar was a heathen king. Look at Joseph under Pharaoh. Raised him up. In every one of these cases, we're talking about someone that was raised up for the purpose of trying to save God's children or protect some of God's servants. In every case, that's what they had done. God would raise the man up so that he was in a position to protect some of God's children. It's one that I'm thinking of that I don't have in my notes. If you turn, it's found over in Esther. I think I talked about this once before. When Esther was married to the king of the Persians, and she was a Jewess, and there had been a law passed that they were going to kill off all the Jews. And Mordecai, her uncle, who had raised her, was having a conversation with her, and he said in chapter 4, Esther chapter 4 and verse 14, look at verse 13 for the context. Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all of the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. I mean, if you don't go to the king and tell him, he'll find another way around it. If God calls you to do something and you don't do it, he'll find another way. He'll find somebody else, right? He'll get the job done. We can't thwart him. If he calls a man and the man says no, well, he'll call another man. He has other ways. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? You see, the point being, Esther was there possibly for that very reason. God had put her in that situation for that very reason. And sometimes God will raise a man up for a reason unbeknownst to anyone else. And so there's no reason to criticize Obadiah, because he was still the governor of this wicked king. So he was. He was still a godly man, even though the king wasn't. And so we read in 1 Kings 18:7, and as Obadiah was in the way, behold, Elijah met him, and he knew him, and fell on his face, and said, Art thou that my Lord Elijah? Matthew Henry said this. He said, Obadiah recognized Elijah, yet he could scarcely believe his eyes. It was remarkable that the prophet had survived the merciless onslaught of Jezebel on the servants of Jehovah. I mean, you would have expected Elijah to be in a ditch somewhere. The way they'd been out looking for him and hunting for him, you would have thought he's a goner. It was still more incredible to see him here alone journeying into Samaria. Most diligent search had long been made for him, but in vain, and now he comes unexpectedly upon him. Who can conceive the mixed feelings of awe and delight as Obadiah gazed upon the man of God, by whose word the awful drought and sore famine had almost completely desolated the land? Obadiah once showed the great respect for him and did obeisance to him. As he had shown the tenderness of a father to the sons of the prophets, so he showed the reverence of a son to the father of the prophets. And by this made it appear that he did indeed fear the Lord greatly. And so Elijah said, he answered him, I am, go tell thy Lord, behold, Elijah is here. Now there's a couple of points I want to make, and then we'll wrap this up. I'll let you guys get out of here a little bit early today because of how long I kept you last week. Number one, I want you to see that Elijah made no attempt. Elijah didn't know Obadiah. Obadiah recognized Elijah, but Elijah didn't know who Obadiah was. But he made no attempt to conceal who he was. None whatsoever. Obadiah asked him if he was Elijah, and he said, yeah, I am. He didn't try to conceal his identity. For all he knew, Obadiah could have been somebody that would take his head off. But he didn't conceal it. He wasn't afraid to own the God of heaven before somebody that was questioning him, and somebody that was in authority questioning him of whether or not he was Elijah. And we shouldn't be either. If the police show up on the doorstep and ask if you're a Christian, I hope your answer will be yes, regardless of what might come. Elijah had no problem with it. We shouldn't either. So let's not shrink from declaring our Christian discipleship should the time arise that someone asks the question. Because you never know, the person that's asking the question might be searching. They might be looking for truth. How do you know? How do you know that when you meet them, it may not be that God arranged it so you would? It's also to be noted that Elijah honored Ahab. Look at this language when he's in verse 18:8, and he answered him, I am, go tell thy Lord. Well, that's Ahab. That's the king. the wicked king. But it's the duty of inferiors to show respect to superiors. That's God's order. He demands that. It's the duty of subjects in concerning their sovereign, of servants concerning their master. We must render to all that to which their office or station entitles them. To not do so is rebellion. And it's no mark of spirituality to be vulgar or conduct ourselves in a low level of speech. I don't much care for the man that sits in the office of the president right now, but he's still the president. And he still is entitled to the respect of the office that he has, even though I don't much care for the man. I'm sure that Elijah didn't much care for Ahab as a wicked king, but he still addressed him as Lord, whether he liked him or not, because that was the office that he held. And even if you don't like the man in the office, it's God's command that you respect the office, even if you don't like the man. In fact, 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 17 says, honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king, even if the king is an Ahab or a Nero. You honor the office. So next week we'll continue our study of Elijah, Lord willing, as we get closer and closer to his showdown at Mount Carmel. And next week he'll show up. Hopefully we'll get to a point where he actually shows up to address Ahab. So with that, I thank you for your kind and patient attention. Let's stand and be dismissed in prayer.